Well, there are many books about David Bowie, some good, some terrible, but they all focus on his career. And I wanted to write a book that was as much about the man as about everything that he produced during his life. The other thing that was interesting to me was to write an oral biography, because there hadn't been an oral biography of Bowie before. And I thought that was a great way of trying to encapsulate his amazing relationships that he had with so many different people. Bowie means something special to me and my generation, because I'm part of that generation that saw him on Top of the Pops in the summer of 1972. And like a lot of impressionable teenagers, it had a huge impression on me. And that's something that that I've carried for the rest of my life in some way, sometimes lightly, sometimes heavily. And I think that Bowie had the kind of effect on young people in the 70s that Bob Dylan had on young people in the 60s, which is why he continues to resonate so much. I think that the relationship that entry-level consumers would have with Bowie these days is very different, because you're living in a world where everything's flat, where you have access to everything. And the importance of David Bowie is, in some respects, accessible in the same way that Picasso is, or the Beatles, or the Rolling Stones, or whoever. And you're dipping in a very different way, and you don't experience the narrative arc. It's impossible for me to say, because I'm not of that generation. So I think he's equally as important. I just think he's probably not as influential to that generation as he was to previous generations. The most outrageous and true story about David Bowie, which is in the book and is something I'd never heard before, is that he was playing in New York at, I think, Madison Square Gardens, and at the after party met a woman, and there was a connection. But he was with his wife, Angie Bowie, so he encouraged her to travel to Philadelphia to see him. She goes to Philadelphia, waiting in the hotel suite. He comes into the hotel after his performance, and she describes a very romantic episode where they're sitting around drinking very expensive red wine, until there's a knock on the door, and it was Stewie George, who is his long-term bodyguard. And he said, "David, I really think you need to see this one." And at this time, Bowie has bright ginger hair, white pan-stick face, looks very freakish. And he goes out and then comes back into the room about 3 or 4 minutes later, even whiter than he was when he'd left, feeling quite shaken because the person who was at the door had tried to sell him a dead body to have sex with. Now this is very strange, but less strange when you consider that every rock star in 1972 and 1973 looked like a member of Led Zeppelin or the Eagles. Everybody wore double denim, they had long hair, they had beards, they had cowboy boots. And David Bowie genuinely looked very, very different. And I think people anticipated that he would have very freakish tastes. He said no, by the way. There was one story that was told to me by a woman called Mary Finnegan, who he spent a lot of time with in the late 60s before he became famous. She was his landlady and then lover, and I think became lover because she was his landlady, because he was quite expedient in that way. He goes off to become famous and then invites her to one of the Ziggy Stardust concerts. I think it was at Earl's Court. So she goes to the concert, it's about 3 years later. She goes to the concert and then goes to the after party. There's lots of after parties in the book. And at the end of the party, he goes up to her, takes her hand, leaves her the door, opens the door and says, "Mary Finnegan, it's been fantastic knowing you," and closes the door. And she knew then that she would never see him again. And that experience is replicated at least 30 times in the book by various different people. People who had a relationship with Bowie for a finite period of time, and then it was over. And almost none of the people I spoke to feel aggrieved by that. They think that the trade-off of working with Bowie, or sleeping with Bowie, or knowing Bowie, or interviewing Bowie was worth the fact that they were a very small part of his life or a very big part of his life for a certain amount of time, and then they knew that they were never going to see him again. Well, the only quotes in the book from Bowie are from interviews that I did with him, and I interviewed him seven times over a sort of 30-year period. And I wanted to make sure that the quotes in the book from him were real, because there are so often quotes get repeated, regurgitated, altered, changed, and I wanted to make sure that the only material from Bowie was material that I'd actually collected myself. Incredibly charming, incredibly smart, wanted you to have as good a time as he was having. There are some people you interview who obviously have no interest in discussing anything with you, particularly these days because of social media, because delivery channels are different. People don't have to go through the media to reach an audience. But he would find out about what you were interested in. As a journalist, he would find out what your penchant was, what your particular thing was. And he'd ask you questions. And he'd want you to leave, A, liking him enormously, but also feeling like there'd been a real connection. So he sort of cared. But he was very, very smart and very, very charming. And I think a lot of people take that and think that he was incredibly expedient. He was expedient in some respects, but I think he generally wanted people to, he wanted to bring joy. And he liked meeting people. He was an autodidact, so ever since he left school, he was consuming information. He was very curious, and that made him a very interesting person to have dinner with, or a very interesting person to interview. I think the most important thing about Bowie is the way that he opened a lot of doors for people. And I think that you can perhaps look at him now as someone who doesn't really know anything about him or his work, and you appreciate the work. But when he appeared in the early 70s, the way that he encouraged people to be more open about their sexuality, about the way they looked, about the way they created, that was incredibly powerful. And he was influential, not just because people copied his music. In fact, they didn't, because it was a very difficult thing to copy. In the same way that it would have been very difficult to copy someone like Bob Dylan. It was very idiosyncratic. But he encouraged people to express themselves. And that, for young people, is very, very, very powerful. The book is full of stories that you've never heard before. The book is full of people who have never been interviewed before. For instance, there's a man called Harry Maslin, who famously produced Bowie's Station to Station, which is acknowledged as his very best record. Never given an interview before, hasn't given an interview in 40 years. And I interviewed him in a Masonic lodge in Santa Monica. And he was fascinating in the amount of detail that he gave about Bowie at that time. Not just in terms of the recording process, but also because of his insane drug use at the time. And so Harry was a fantastic person to talk to, as were dozens of other people in the book. It was very difficult to initiate a lot of these conversations because I was asking people to share their thoughts about Bowie. Some people who were very, very close to him. Not long after he died, it was only a couple of months after he died, so you feel like a bit of an ambulance chaser. So the first approach is really, really important. The tone is really important. Stressing the fact that you're trying to do something different and you're trying to honour Bowie, and that the book is coming from a place of love. But I figured there are three different types of people that I needed in the book. There are the 50 people that you need to speak to in order to be taken seriously as a Bowie biographer, and they tend to be talked to by everybody. Then there are the 50 people who have just as much right to be in a book like this, like film directors, actors, lovers, hairdressers, makeup artists, photographers, who very rarely get spoken to. And then there is the third tranche, who sort of happen serendipitously when I'm interviewing someone and that person says, well, have you spoken to Kevin? And you go, who's Kevin? And you endeavour to find and interview Kevin, so there are a lot of Kevins in the book. My favourite Bowie album is Young Americans, and my favourite Bowie song is probably a song called Can You Hear Me? Because I think lots of people think that Young Americans is his sort of fake soul album, his phony soul album. It's not. It's a really good soul album, and it's one of the greatest records of the 1970s.